night of the claiming feast had arrived, and every soul in the village of Ashford knew what that meant. Once every 3 years, when the harvest moon hung low and heavy over the Iron Peak Mountains, the packs gathered inside the great hall of Lord Cedric's keep. Banners of every clan hung from the stone rafters, crimson and black for Clan Duskfang, silver and forest green for Clan Hollowmere, deep gold and brown for Clan Ashford itself. Torches burned in iron brackets along the walls, casting long amber shadows across the flagstone floor. The smell of roasted boar, pine resin, and warm mead filled every corner of the hall. It was the night when wolves could be claimed, when a bond could be announced before all the packs, when a young woman might finally be chosen. Clara stood just inside the arched doorway and tried to remember how to breathe. She was 23 years old and had attended 2 of these feasts before, both times as a servant, carrying platters of bread and refilling goblets of wine without a single alpha's gaze resting on her for more than a heartbeat. She was an Omega, the daughter of a woodcutter who had died 3 winters past, and she lived now on the edge of the village in a cottage small enough that the wind found every crack in the walls. But this year was different. This year she had been invited, not as a servant, but as a guest. Lord Cedric's son, Dorian, had come to her cottage 6 weeks ago. He had stood in her doorway with his broad shoulders filling the frame, and his amber eyes warm with something that looked very much like sincerity. He had told her she was remarkable. He had told her he saw something in her that the others did not. He had asked her, quietly and with what seemed like genuine feeling, to come to the claiming feast not with a platter in her hands, but with her hair unbound and her chin held high. "I want to see you there," he had said. "I want everyone to see you." Clara had sewn the dress herself. 3 weeks of careful, aching work by candlelight, her fingers sore from the needle. It was pale linen, the color of winter cream, with a belt of soft brown leather cinched at the waist. It was not silk. It was not embroidered with gold thread. But it was hers, made with the last of the good cloth her mother had left behind. And when she had tried it on the night before, her neighbor Marta had pressed both hands to her mouth and said with glistening eyes that she looked like someone who deserved to be chosen. She had worn her long blonde hair in a careful braid over one shoulder, the way her mother used to style it for feast days. A small wooden clasp, carved by her father into the shape of a running wolf, held it together at the end. It was the only fine thing she owned. Now she stood in the doorway of Lord Cedric's great hall, and the warmth of the torches touched her face, and for one suspended moment she allowed herself to hope. Her friend Wren appeared at her elbow, small and quick-eyed, her dark hair pinned under a linen coif. Wren was a beta, the daughter of the village seamstress, and she had helped Clara press the dress that afternoon with a warm iron and lavender water. "You look wonderful," Wren whispered, squeezing her hand. "Don't you dare look at the floor tonight." Clara squared her shoulders. "I won't." She moved into the hall. The long tables were crowded with wolves of every rank. Alphas at the high table near the dais, betas filling the center rows, omegas and lesser-ranked wolves near the back. The noise was enormous. Laughter, the clang of goblets, the deep rumble of alpha voices debating territory and trade. The air smelled of pine smoke, roasted meat, and the sharp layered scents of a dozen different packs mingled together. Clara found a place near the middle of the hall, where guests without a specific seat were permitted to stand or take an empty bench. She looked toward the high table. Dorian was already there. He sat beside his father, Lord Cedric, a broad, gray-muzzled alpha with a lord's chain across his chest, and beside Dorian sat a young woman Clara did not immediately recognize. She had copper-colored hair and wore a gown of deep green velvet with embroidered cuffs, and she laughed at something Dorian said with the easy confidence of someone who had never once questioned her own place in a room. Clara told herself it meant nothing. Dorian had many obligations as a lord's son. There were always people to speak to at a feast. She waited. An hour passed. The boar was carved and served. Mead and spiced wine made their rounds. The noise in the hall grew louder as the fire in the central hearth was stoked higher. Clara stood near the edge of the room with a cup she had not touched, watching the high table. Dorian did not look at her once. At the second hour, the claiming rite began. Lord Cedric rose from his chair and called for silence in the old tongue, his voice carrying the weight of alpha command through the hall like a physical force. Every conversation cut short. Every head turned. The Lord spoke of the bonds between packs. He spoke of the sacred nature of the mate bond, of loyalty and strength and the continuation of the bloodline. He spoke of his son Dorian, who had come of age and who would tonight make his choice known before the assembled clans. Clara's heart turned over in her chest. Dorian stood. He was tall and handsome in a coat of dark wool, his amber eyes scanning the hall with a calm, practiced ease. He lifted his cup. And then he turned to the young woman beside him, the one with the copper hair and the velvet gown. And he said, in a clear voice that reached every corner of the stone hall, "I choose Seraphine of Clan Hollowmere. Let the bond be witnessed." The hall erupted in noise. Clara did not move. She stood very still, while the sound crashed over her like cold water. The cheering, the stamping of boots, the clash of goblets raised in toast. She stood still, while Dorian took Seraphine's hand, and the girl smiled with the radiance of someone whose future had just been confirmed. She stood still until she was certain her legs would carry her. Then she set her untouched cup on the nearest table, turned, and walked toward the door. She did not run. She would not run. She would not give this hall, or these wolves, or Dorian the satisfaction of watching her break. Her chin stayed level. Her steps stayed even. The carved wooden clasp at the end of her braid swung gently against her chest, her father's work, the only fine thing she owned, and she pressed one hand briefly over it as she moved through the crowd. She was almost at the arch when she heard it. A low sound. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable to any wolf-born ear. The quiet, deep intake of breath that meant someone had just caught a scent that stopped them cold. And then a voice, male, unhurried. "She's leaving." Another voice, lighter, faintly amused. "So she is. Interesting timing, wouldn't you say?" A third voice, closest to her ear, low enough that it might have been meant only for the air itself. "Don't let her reach that door." Clara's steps slowed without her permission. The hair on the back of her neck rose. She turned. 3 men stood near the far wall, apart from the crowd in the way that only wolves of very high rank could afford to stand, with space around them, not because others had moved away, but because no one had dared crowd close. They were not wearing the colors of Clan Ashford or Clan Hollowmere. Their garments were dark, leather and wool and fur, bearing no local banner. The tallest of them stood slightly ahead of the other 2, and he was watching her with eyes the color of deep winter sky. Black braids, a jaw set like carved stone, a scar along one cheekbone that did nothing to diminish the sheer, still authority of his face. Clara had never seen him before, but every instinct she had, Omega instincts she had spent 23 years learning to quiet and ignore, went completely, terrifyingly silent. As if something inside her had finally, after a very long time, recognized something it had been waiting for. The tall man took one step toward her, just one, but the space between them seemed to close far more than a single step should allow. "You dropped this," he said. He held out his hand. In his palm lay the small wooden clasp carved into the shape of a running wolf, her father's clasp, the one that had held her braid. She had not even felt it fall. Clara stared at the carved wooden clasp resting in the center of his palm. It was such a small thing. A piece of worn wood no larger than a thumb, smoothed by years of handling, shaped by her father's knife into the rough silhouette of a running wolf. She had carried it to every hard day and every quiet grief since his death, and she had not even noticed it fall. She reached out and took it from his hand. Their fingers did not touch. He had left enough space between the clasp and his own skin that she could retrieve it without contact, and she understood instinctively that this was deliberate, a courtesy she had not expected from a man who radiated the kind of authority that usually demanded the world bend toward it rather than the other way around. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He said nothing. He simply watched her with those winter blue eyes, and the watching was not unkind, but it was very thorough, and Clara had the strange and unsettling sensation of being seen, not observed, not assessed the way the wolves at the high table had assessed her rank and her dress and her bloodline and found all of them wanting, but seen, the way you see something when you are genuinely trying to understand what it is. The lighter voice came from her left. "Remarkable." He said more words to her in 30 seconds than he said to Lord Cedric's entire welcoming party. She turned. The second man leaned against the stone wall with his arms crossed, and an expression of open, cheerful interest on his face. He was younger looking than the first, with dark auburn hair and a sharp, clever mouth that suggested he found most situations entertaining and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. "Don't embarrass us, Stellan," said the third man, who stood slightly behind and to the right. He was darker in coloring than the other two, with close-cropped black hair and an expression of calm watchfulness that reminded Clara of a hawk perched on a high branch. Still, patient, and completely without mercy. A thin scar ran along his jaw, old and silver. The auburn-haired one, Stellan, smiled without the slightest sign of feeling embarrassed. "I'm simply noting what everyone in this room has already noticed. Our king has spoken more freely in the last half-minute than he has in the past 3 days of travel." King. The word landed in Clara's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She looked back at the tall man with the black braids and the winter eyes and the scar along his cheekbone, and something cold and clarifying moved through her. She had not recognized him because she had never been in a position to see him. She was an Omega from a border village. The only images she had of the Alpha King were the carved reliefs on the stone pillars of the village's great oak, formal, distant, more symbol than person. But she knew the name. Every wolf in every pack within 100 leagues knew the name. Leander. Alpha King of the Iron Peak Dominion, ruler of 9 packs, son of the last king, who had united the clans through 30 years of war and left his son a kingdom bound together with iron and blood and law. Clara became very aware of the fact that she was standing in a village feast hall in a dress she had sewn herself, holding a wooden clasp carved by a dead woodcutter in front of the most powerful alpha alive. She dipped into a bow. It was not the deep floor-grazing curtsy of a trained courtier. She did not know how to do that. It was the respectful, clean bow of someone who understood hierarchy, even if she had never been taught its formalities. "My Lord King," she said. "I did not know you were attending Lord Cedric's feast." "I wasn't," Leander said. "We were passing through. We stopped for the night." He said it simply, without elaboration, and Clara had the impression that he was a man who considered unnecessary words a form of waste. Behind her, the noise of the hall continued. The cheering for Dorian's claiming had softened into the low, celebratory murmur of a crowd settling back into its drink and its conversation. No one had yet noticed that the Alpha King was standing near the doorway talking to an Omega in a homespun dress. Or perhaps they had noticed, and were simply too uncertain of the protocol to react. "You were leaving," Leander said. It was not a question. "Yes," Clara said, before the feast was finished. "Yes." He studied her face for a moment. "Why?" It was such a direct question that for a moment she simply didn't know what to do with it. Wolves of high rank did not usually ask the reasons behind an Omega's choices. They either ignored those choices entirely or issued instructions to replace them. "I had finished what I came to do," she said, which was technically true, even if what she had come to do and what had actually happened were two entirely different things. Stellan made a quiet sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. The dark-haired man with the hawk's eyes said nothing. but something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Leander, to his credit, did not press the point. Instead, he looked at her for another moment, that same thorough, unhurried looking. And then he said, "Your scent is unusual." Clara blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I noticed it when we entered the hall," he said. "It was difficult to locate the source. There are too many wolves in a small space, but when you moved toward the door it became clear." She did not know what to say to this. An Omega's scent being remarked upon by any Alpha was notable. An Omega's scent being remarked upon by the Alpha King in the middle of a feast hall was something for which she had no framework whatsoever. "I don't know what that means," she said honestly. "Neither do I," he said. "Not yet." Stellan pushed off from the wall. "What our eloquent king means to say is that you smell like something very old and very rare, and that we would like very much to know your name before you disappear through that door." Clara looked at him, then back at Leander. The Alpha King's expression had not changed, but he did not contradict his companion. "Clara," she said. "Clara of Ashford. My father was a woodcutter. My mother was a healer's apprentice. I am an Omega of no particular rank." "Clara," Leander repeated. He said it the way you say something when you are deciding whether it belongs somewhere. "Do you intend to remain in Ashford?" The question caught her off guard. "It is where I live." "That is not what I asked." She opened her mouth and closed it again. Around them, the feast hall continued its noise and its warmth, and the torches crackled, and the smell of pine smoke drifted between them. And Clara became aware that somewhere behind her, Dorian was toasting his newly claimed mate, and the rest of the hall was celebrating a bond that had nothing to do with her, had never had anything to do with her. "I haven't thought beyond tonight," she admitted. It was more honesty than she had intended to offer, but something about the directness of his questions made deflection feel pointless. Leander held her gaze. "Then think about it," he said quietly. "I will want an answer in the morning." Before she could ask what that meant, or why the Alpha King of Nine Packs would require an answer to any question from an Omega woodcutter's daughter, a commotion rose near the high table. Lord Cedric had spotted his royal guest. The old lord was already rising from his chair, his face cycling rapidly through surprise and alarm, and the particular urgent hospitality of a man who has just realized that the most powerful Alpha in the Dominion has been standing near his back wall for an unknown length of time without being properly received. Leander turned toward the approaching lord, with the unhurried calm of someone who had been received by dignitaries his entire life, and found the process mildly tedious. Clara took the opening. She slipped through the arched doorway and out into the cold night air. The darkness closed around her like a held breath. The village of Ashford lay quiet beyond the keep's torchlit yard. Frost on the cobblestones. The distant sound of an owl somewhere in the dark pines. The smell of cold earth and wood smoke from the cottages below. She pulled her gray cloak tight around her shoulders and walked quickly, the wooden clasp pressed between her fingers. She told herself not to think about Winter Blue Eyes, or the strange, settled feeling that had come over her when he'd said her name. She walked home along the forest path, and the night was very still, and somewhere in the dark pines beside the road she heard, or imagined she heard, the soft sound of large paws moving parallel to her through the trees. Keeping pace, not threatening, just present. She did not look, but she did not feel afraid. Clara did not sleep. She lay on her narrow bed in the cottage and stared at the ceiling beams, and listened to the wind move through the pine trees outside her window. And every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same thing, a pair of winter blue eyes watching her with that unhurried, complete attention, and a large hand held open, a small wooden clasp resting at the center of the palm. "I will want an answer in the morning." An answer to what? Exactly? He had not asked her a question with clear edges. He had asked whether she intended to remain in Ashford, and when she had said it was where she lived, he had told her that was not what he meant. And then Lord Cedric had descended upon them with all the frantic hospitality of a man trying to compensate for a very significant oversight, and she had slipped away into the cold dark before anyone could stop her. She pressed the wooden clasp against her sternum and breathed. Her father had carved it the winter before she turned 8. He had sat by the fire on a long frozen evening with his small knife and a piece of applewood, and she had watched his hands move with patient, unhurried confidence, the same way he did everything, until the shape of the running wolf emerged from the grain. He had pressed it into her palm and said, "This is what you are, little one. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She had never entirely understood what he meant. She was an Omega, the lowest rank, the kind of wolf that alphas overlooked and betas pitied, and the world in general considered background. But her father had given her a running wolf, not a still one, not a cowering one, a running one. She rose before dawn, built up the fire from the banked coals, and set water to boil over the hearth. She had work to do regardless of what strange things had happened the night before. The goats needed feeding, the wood needed splitting. She had let the pile run low this week, distracted by the preparations for the feast, and old widow Hessa at the far end of the village had asked her 3 days ago to bring a bundle of dried herbs when she had the chance, the kind that helped with joint pain in cold weather. Clara braided her hair, pulled on her heaviest cloak, and went out into the gray pre-dawn. The frost was hard underfoot, her breath clouded in the cold air. The village was still sleeping, the cottages dark and the paths empty, the only sounds the creak of frozen branches and the distant call of a crow somewhere above the tree line. She fed the goats, split enough wood to refill the pile beside the door, and then gathered old Hessa's herbs from the bundles hanging in her rafters and wrapped them in a square of clean cloth. She had just stepped back outside, bundle under her arm, when she stopped. There was a wolf in her yard. Not a shifted wolf, not a man standing in the gray morning light. An actual wolf, in its animal form, lying at the edge of the tree line where the forest met the edge of her small garden. It was large for a common wolf, but smaller than a true alpha's shifted form. Dark gray in color, almost black, with one front paw held slightly off the ground. Clara stood very still. The wolf looked at her. Its eyes were amber, clear, and entirely without aggression. It was simply watching her the way an exhausted traveler watches a fire, with longing and with the particular stillness of an animal that has decided to wait and see what the world will do next. She looked at the paw. Even from the distance of the garden path, she could see it. A dark matting of fur, the stiffness of an injury. She went inside and came back out with a clean rag, a small clay pot of the pine sap drawing salve she kept for her own cuts and bruises, and a bowl of water with a piece of the coarse bread she had baked 2 days ago floating in it, softened. She set the bowl down at a distance first. An offering, not an approach. The wolf watched her. She sat down on the cold ground 5 feet away, not standing over it, not looming, not performing authority she did not have. And she waited. After a long moment, the wolf pushed itself upright on 3 legs, limped to the bowl, and drank. Then it ate the softened bread with the careful, concentrated effort of an animal that was hungrier than it wanted to admit. When it had finished, it looked at her again. "All right," Clara said quietly. "May I see it?" She moved slowly. She kept her hands visible. She did not reach out until the wolf had lowered its head and allowed her to come close. And then she worked the same way her mother had taught her to work with injured animals, with patience, without hurry, talking softly about nothing in particular, because the voice mattered more than the words. The wound was deep but clean. Something had caught the paw. A trap, she thought, or a sharp root under the ice. She cleaned it carefully with the wet cloth, applied the salve with gentle pressure, and wrapped the paw in a strip of the clean rag, tying it loosely enough not to cut the circulation. The wolf bore all of it without sound, without flinching, watching her face the entire time with those clear amber eyes. When she was done, She sat back and looked at it. "You should stay off it for a day," she said. "The salve will draw the cold out and close the wound. But if you shift back too soon, it will reopen." The wolf regarded her for a moment. Then it did something she had not expected. It lowered its great head and rested its chin very briefly, very gently, on her knee. Then it rose, turned, and walked back into the pines. She watched it go until the gray trees swallowed it entirely. She sat there in the frost for another minute, her hands still faintly warm from the work, the pine sap smell of the salve on her fingers. Then she gathered the bundle of herbs and went to deliver them to old Hessa. She had almost reached the widow's cottage at the far end of the village lane when she heard it. A sound that stopped every other thought in her head. A deep, resonant sound that she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. A howl. Then another. Then more. Layering over each other in the way that only a coordinated pack could manage. Not the wild, separate calls of individual wolves, but a unified sound, structured and deliberate. The kind of sound that meant something specific to every wolf-born creature within hearing range. It was a king's arrival call. Clara turned slowly. At the top of the village lane, where the road from the keep descended into the lower village, a group of wolves stood in their shifted forms. Not 2 or 3. Not a patrol. Dozens. Large, dark, disciplined, their breath steaming in the cold morning air, arranged in a loose formation that suggested both military precision and pack hierarchy. And walking down the center of the lane, in his human form, dressed in the dark leather and fur she had seen the night before, black braids over one shoulder, and winter blue eyes finding her across the distance as if they had known exactly where to look. Leander. At his right, Stellan walked with his hands clasped behind his back and an expression of deep personal satisfaction. At his left, the dark-haired, hawk-eyed man moved with the quiet, contained readiness of someone whose job was to be prepared for anything. Leander stopped 10 feet from her. Around them, the village was waking up. Doors were opening. Faces appeared in windows. Clara could hear the rapid murmur of voices beginning to ripple through Ashford like water moving downhill. The Alpha King. The Alpha King is here. He's in the lower village. Why is he in the lower village? "You didn't wait for morning," Leander said. "I had work to do," Clara said. She was still holding the bundle of herbs, she realized. She was standing in a frozen village lane, holding a bundle of dried herbs for an old woman's joint pain, while the Alpha King of the Iron Peak Dominion looked at her with those still, serious eyes. "So did I," he said. He reached into the fold of his cloak and held something out to her. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. It was a small clay pot, identical to the one sitting on her kitchen shelf. And wrapped around the outside of it, tied neatly, was a strip of clean white cloth, the kind used for wound dressing, the kind she had tied around a gray wolf's paw in the cold gray morning, less than an hour ago, the kind that still carried the faint smell of pine sap salve. Clara looked at the pot. Then she looked at Leander's left hand, where a faint mark was visible at the base of his palm, just above the wrist, where a wrapping might have sat for the better part of a morning. The world went very quiet around her. "That was you," she said. It was not a question, but he answered it anyway. "I wanted to know," he said simply, "what you would do." The village lane had gone completely still. Not the natural stillness of a cold morning, but the held-breath stillness of an entire community that had stepped outside to understand what was happening and had collectively decided that moving or speaking might disturb something important. Clara could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on the lane. The baker's wife frozen in her doorway with flour on her hands. Old Hessa peering from her window with the sharp attention of a woman who had seen many things in her long life. 3 young wolves from the lower quarter, standing with their mouths open at the sight of the pack assembled outside their village. Clara looked at the strip of white cloth tied around the clay pot in Leander's outstretched hand. "You were testing me," she said. No, he said. The correction was immediate and without apology. Testing implies I doubted the outcome. I did not. I wanted to see it. She looked up at his face. He was entirely serious. There was no game in his expression, no amusement at her expense, no satisfaction at having caught her in surprise. He simply looked at her the way he had looked at her the night before, with that thorough, patient attention that felt less like scrutiny and more like listening. "You were injured," she said, genuinely. "I encountered a root trap on the ridge path north of the village. It was careless of me. I was distracted." A brief pause. "I had caught a scent I was trying to locate." Behind him, Stellan pressed his lips together very firmly. The hawk-eyed man continued to look at the middle distance with the disciplined expression of someone who had committed to perfect neutrality. Clara was quiet for a moment. The cold air moved between them, carrying pine and frost and that faint, complex scent she had noticed even in the crowded feast hall. Dark wood and iron and something older beneath it, something she couldn't name but that her instincts recognized with the same wordless certainty as the smell of rain before a storm. "You could have come to my door," she said, "as yourself." "Yes," he agreed, "but you didn't." "No." She studied him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that he was choosing his words with the same care he applied to everything. Not because he was uncertain of them, but because he considered language a thing worth handling precisely. "Because what you would do for a king," he said at last, "and what you would do for a wounded animal alone in the cold are not always the same thing. And I needed to know which one was true." Clara felt something move through her chest. Not warmth exactly, but the particular feeling of a thing slotting into place. Like a key finding its lock not with force, but with a simple, quiet rightness. She handed old Hessa's bundle of herbs to the nearest person, who happened to be Stellan. He accepted them with the gracious composure of a man who was absolutely going to find this funny later. Then she looked back at Leander. "It was the same thing," she said. "It's always the same thing. I don't know how to be one way for a king and another way for a wolf in pain. I only know the one way." Something shifted in his eyes. It was subtle, the way light shifts on deep water. But it was there. "I know," he said. "That is why I'm here." He lowered his outstretched hand and tucked the pot back into his cloak. The pack behind him remained where they were, still, patient, watching. And Clara noticed now what she had been too startled to observe before. They were not arranged in a threatening formation. They were arranged the way a pack arranges itself when it is presenting itself to someone. Formally, respectfully. The way wolves stand when they are being introduced to something that matters. "Clara of Ashford," Leander said. And the formality of his tone made several people on the lane straighten without realizing it. "I would speak with you. Properly. If you are willing." "And if I'm not?" she asked. She did not know why she asked it. Something in her needed to know the answer. "Then I will thank you for your care and take my pack north before midday," he said. "The choice is yours. No pressure, no rank. No implication that refusal was impossible or unwise, or anything other than a genuine option." She nodded. "Then speak." Lord Cedric's keep was offered as the location. The Lord himself appeared at the bottom of the lane within minutes, slightly breathless, and wearing the expression of a man who had just realized his entire feast night had been entirely overshadowed by events he did not understand. And Clara found herself walking up through the village under the quiet, enormous presence of the Alpha King's pack, while the rest of Ashford watched from every doorway and window they possessed. Wren appeared at her elbow from nowhere, seized her wrist and hissed, "Clara, what is happening? Tell me everything immediately." "Later," Clara murmured. Is that the Alpha King? Why does he keep looking at you?" "Clara, later, Wren." They were given Lord Cedric's council chamber. A stone room with a long oak table, a fire burning in the iron grate, and maps pinned to the walls with bronze tacks. Lord Cedric hovered in the doorway with an expression of profound uncertainty, until Stellan very pleasantly suggested that the Lord might be more comfortable waiting in the hall, and the Lord discovered that he agreed. Clara sat on one side of the table. Leander sat across from her. Stellan and the dark-haired man, whose name, she learned, was Coran, and who served as the king's chief tracker and second blade, took positions near the wall, present but at a distance that acknowledged this conversation was not entirely theirs. Leander folded his hands on the table. His forearms were bare below the rolled sleeves of his linen undershirt, and she could see the edge of the wrap still visible on the side of his left hand, disappearing under the leather vambrace. "I want to explain something to you," he said, "and I want you to hear it entirely before you respond. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. He nodded. "I have ruled the Iron Peak Dominion for 11 years. I inherited a kingdom that my father built through war and held together through law. It requires constant attention, constant judgment, and a very clear sense of what is worth protecting and what is not. I have made peace with the understanding that most of what I value will be found in those two things, the law and the work. I had stopped expecting to find it in a person." Clara said nothing. She had promised to listen. 3 nights ago on the ridge above Ashford, I caught a scent on the wind that I could not identify. I have been around wolves my entire life. I know every scent type, every rank, every bloodline marker. This was none of those things. It was something older. He paused. I have spent my life learning to trust what my instincts tell me about threats and about strength. Last night in that feast hall, when you walked toward the door, when you kept your chin level and your steps, even after what that man did, my instincts told me something they have never told me about another person before. "What did they tell you?" she asked, because she could not help it. "That I was looking at someone of genuine worth," he said, "and that if I let you walk out that door without speaking, I would regret it for the rest of my life." The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, the muffled sounds of the village reached them through the stone walls. Voices, movement, the distant low sounds of the pack settling. "I am an Omega," Clara said carefully. "A woodcutter's daughter. I have no rank, no bloodline of note, no political value to a king." "I'm aware of all of that," Leander said. "Then I don't understand what you're asking." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I am asking if you would be willing to come north with us, to Iron Peak, not as a captive, not as a ward, not under any obligation, as a guest with full freedom to leave whenever you choose. I want time to understand what I am sensing from you, and I cannot do that in a village lane in one morning." Clara looked at him across the oak table, at the scar on his cheekbone, silver in the firelight, at the stillness of him, not the stillness of someone suppressing something, but the stillness of someone who simply was, fully and completely, whatever they were. "There is something else," she said slowly. "Something you haven't said yet." His jaw shifted slightly. "Yes." "What is it?" He held her gaze. "My trackers found something when they scouted the village this morning. In the old burial records kept at the keep. A name." He reached inside his cloak and placed a folded piece of parchment on the table between them. She opened it. The ink was old, brown at the edges, written in the formal script of a keep recorder. It was a lineage entry, the kind made when a notable bloodline passed through a territory. Her eyes moved down the names, following the line of descent until she reached the bottom, until she saw her mother's name. And beside it, a mark she recognized, not from any document she had ever read, but from the wooden clasp her father had carved. The same running wolf, the same lines, the same shape. Beneath the name was a single notation in the recorder's hand. Last known descendant of the Ashfield line. Bloodline status. Unverified but probable. Scent marker. Ancient. Clara's hands were very still on the parchment. The Ashvale line, Leander said quietly, has been considered extinct for 60 years. They were the founding bloodline of the original pack that became the Iron Peak Dominion. Their scent marker is written about in the oldest records we have. A pause. It is described as unlike any other. Something old. Something that the wolves around it recognize without being able to explain why. Clara looked up from the parchment. Across the table, Leander watched her with those winter blue eyes, and he said nothing more, because he understood that she needed a moment to let the world rearrange itself around this new information. Her father had given her a running wolf. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Clara sat with the parchment in her hands for a long time. The fire in the iron grate burned low and steady. Outside the council chamber, the sounds of Ashford continued their morning rhythm. The blacksmith's hammer somewhere down the hill, the calls of traders opening their stalls, the occasional deeper sound of the pack moving through the village with the quiet, disciplined presence of wolves who had been trained not to disturb what they passed through. Normal sounds. Familiar sounds. The sounds of every morning she had lived in this village since her father died, and left her the cottage and the goats and the wooden clasp and nothing else. She set the parchment down. My mother never told me, she said. She may not have known, Leander said. The Ashvale line went into hiding when the old wars began. Names were changed, records were buried, it was safer to be no one. She was a healer's apprentice, Clara said. She knew every herb in the forest, and every remedy in the region, and she died of a fever when I was 14, because she gave her last medicine to a child in the village who needed it more. She paused. That was the kind of person she was. Yes, Leander said. It appears to run in the blood. She looked at him. He was not being poetic. He was stating what he considered a fact, with the same directness he applied to everything, and the simplicity of it undid her more than any elaborate declaration could have. She folded the parchment carefully and placed it on the table between them. I have conditions, she said. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, but a kind of focused attention, as if she had just become more interesting. Speak them. Wren comes with me. She is my oldest friend, and I will not leave her behind without a choice. Agreed. I am not a prize or a symbol. If this bloodline means something politically, I will not be used as a banner to wave at other packs. Agreed. No hesitation. And I choose my own place in whatever comes next. You said I could leave whenever I chose. I need that to be true, not a courtesy that disappears once we are inside Iron Peak's walls. Leander was quiet for a moment. Not because he was weighing whether to agree, she sensed, but because he was making sure what he said next was exact. Clara of Ashford, he said. I have ruled 9 packs for 11 years. In that time I have given my word on matters of war, of law, of border and blood, and I have never broken it. I give it to you now on all 3 conditions, freely and without reservation. You will leave whenever you choose. You will be no one's symbol, and your friend is welcome in my keep for as long as she wishes to stay. She believed him. That was the strange thing. She believed him completely, not because she was naive, but because she had spent 23 years learning to read the difference between words that were performed and words that were meant, and these were meant. Then I'll come, she said. They left Ashford 2 hours later. Wren, when informed of the situation in approximately 90 seconds of urgent whispered explanation in Clara's cottage doorway, went through the stages of disbelief, astonishment, and practical acceptance with remarkable speed, and emerged from the cottage 10 minutes later with a packed bag and an expression of determined composure that only slightly failed to conceal her absolute wonder at the situation. The Alpha King? She murmured to Clara as they walked up the lane toward where the horses were being readied. Clara. The Alpha King. I know. He came with the whole pack. I know, Wren. For you. Please stop. Wren stopped. Then, after 3 seconds, Your mother's bloodline is ancient nobility, and you've been splitting your own firewood for 3 years. Wren. I'm just noting the contrast. Stellan, who was passing them at that moment with a saddlebag over one shoulder, said pleasantly, I like her, and kept walking. Dorian appeared as they reached the top of the lane. He must have heard. The whole village had heard. The whole village had seen. And he came from the direction of the keep with his coat hastily fastened, and his amber eyes moving rapidly between Clara and the assembled pack and the tall, dark-braided figure of the Alpha King standing beside the lead horse with the particular stillness that seemed to clear space around him, simply by existing. Clara, Dorian said. He stopped a few feet away. His voice had the careful quality of someone who is recalibrating very quickly. I wanted to say, you don't need to, Clara said. She said it without anger. That surprised her. A little. She had expected to feel something sharp when she saw him, the residue of the night before, the memory of standing in that hall with her untouched cup and her handmade dress while he announced his choice to the assembled clans. But what she felt instead was something much quieter, a kind of distance, as though she were looking at something that had once seemed very close, and now revealed itself to have always been much smaller than she thought. I think I made a mistake, Dorian said, and he was looking at her with an expression that was partly genuine regret, and partly the dawning comprehension of someone who has just understood what he failed to see. Perhaps, Clara said, but it was your choice to make, and you made it. I hope you and Seraphine are well suited. She paused. I genuinely mean that. She did. She walked past him. She did not look back. The road north to Iron Peak took 4 days. They traveled through forests of ancient pine and across stone bridges above winter rivers, and through high passes where the wind came down from the mountains cold and clean and tasting of snow and altitude. The pack moved around them like a living current. Wolves in their shifted forms running alongside the road, covering the flanks, moving through the trees with a silence and coordination that Clara found herself watching with open fascination. Leander rode beside her, not always speaking, often simply present, the way the mountains were present, solidly, without requiring acknowledgement. But when he did speak, it was with that same careful directness, and she found herself speaking back the same way, and the conversations that grew between them over 4 days of cold road and firelit evenings felt less like the beginning of something, and more like the continuation of something that had simply been waiting for both of them to arrive. On the second evening, camped in a way station shelter with the horses settled and the pack distributed through the trees around them, Stellan produced a flask of something warm and honey-spiced and proposed a toast to what he called the most productive trap injury in the history of the Iron Peak Dominion. Coran, for the first time in Clara's observation, smiled. It was brief and contained, but it was real. Leander said, Stellan, in a tone that conveyed an entire paragraph of meaning in 2 syllables. Stellan drank his toast alone and looked entirely satisfied. Wren had attached herself to Stellan with the cheerful inevitability of 2 people who share the same quality of sharp, entertained attention toward the world, and by the 3rd day, they were deep in an ongoing debate about the relative merits of various regional cheeses that Clara suspected was only partially about cheese. On the 4th evening, as Iron Peak's walls appeared on the horizon, stone towers rising against a winter sky the color of pale iron, banners dark against the fading light. Leander brought his horse close to hers, and they rode side by side in silence for a while, watching the keep grow larger against the sky. Are you afraid? He asked. No, she said, and then honestly, a little. Good, he said. Fear means you understand the weight of something. It means you're paying attention. She looked at him. Are you ever afraid? He was quiet for a moment. Then, every day, of making the wrong judgment, of failing the people the law is supposed to protect. A pause. Of being the kind of ruler my father was in the last years, when he was so certain of his own correctness that he stopped listening. It was the most he had said about himself in 4 days. She understood that it was not something he said easily, or often. "You listened to a wounded wolf in a cold garden," she said. "I don't think you've stopped listening." He looked at her for a long moment, and the last of the day's light caught the scar on his cheekbone and the winter color of his eyes, and something in his expression settled, the way a long-carried weight settles when you finally set it down in the right place. The gates of Iron Peak opened before them. The pack's arrival call went up, layered, resonant, filling the mountain air, and the keep answered it with torches lit along the walls and the deep bell of the Iron Gate Tower ringing twice in welcome. Wolves lined the inner yard, the household guard and the pack members who had remained behind, and they parted to let the column through with the formal, deliberate respect of a court receiving its king. And beside the king, on a plain road horse with a gray cloak and a blonde braid and a small wooden clasp carved into the shape of a running wolf, Clara rode through the gates of Iron Peak. She did not know everything that would come next. She knew there would be complexity, packs to navigate, a bloodline to understand, a place to find in a world that was entirely new. She knew there would be days of uncertainty, and probably days of difficulty. But she also knew this. In the great hall of Lord Cedric's keep, she had walked toward a door with her chin level and her steps even, carrying nothing but her own dignity and a carved piece of apple wood. And the most powerful alpha in the Dominion had crossed a room to return what she had dropped. Not because of her bloodline, not because of her scent or her lineage, or the ancient name written in brown ink on a recorder's parchment, because of what she had done in a cold garden at dawn, alone, when no one she thought was watching. In the weeks that followed, the story settled into its true shape. The Ashvale bloodline was formally verified by Iron Peak's eldest record keeper, a small, fierce woman named Petra, who had spent 40 years maintaining the Dominion's historical archives, and who announced the finding with the contained triumph of someone whose life's work had just produced something remarkable. The verification changed certain things in the Dominion's politics. Old alliances shifted. Certain pack lords who had been considering challenges to the king's authority found themselves reconsidering in light of a bloodline that predated their own. But Clara refused to be made into a symbol of any of it, and Leander held to his word completely and without exception. She was given rooms in the keep's eastern tower, overlooking the pine forest and the mountain pass. She was given access to the keep's stores of medicinal herbs, a collection that made her mother's knowledge look like a beginning. And within a month she had established herself as something between a healer and an advisor, moving through the keep with the quiet, purposeful confidence of someone who has finally found the right scale for their capabilities. Wren stayed. She and Stellan's debate about cheese evolved, over several months, into something that required considerably less discussion and considerably more proximity, which surprised no one except Wren herself. Karan, it turned out, had a younger sister in the outer villages who had been injured in a border skirmish 3 winters past and had never fully healed. Clara spent 2 weeks working with the keep's curandero on the case, and when the woman walked without pain for the first time in 3 years, Karan looked at Clara with those hawk-sharp eyes and said simply, "Thank you." It was, Stellan later informed her, the most effusive expression of gratitude Karan had offered any living person in recorded memory. Lord Cedric sent a formal letter of congratulation that was so thoroughly composed of political calculation, disguised as warmth, that Clara and Leander read it together one evening by the fire, and were both, for the first time in that context, genuinely amused. Dorian of Ashford married Seraphine of Clan Hollowmere that spring. By all accounts, they were reasonably content. Clara wished them well and meant it. On a morning in early spring, when the snow on the mountain passes was beginning to soften, and the first green was coming back into the pines, Leander found Clara in the eastern tower garden, where she had begun cultivating herbs in the raised stone beds along the wall. He stood in the garden doorway and watched her work for a moment, her hands in the earth, her braid over one shoulder, the wooden clasp at the end catching the pale spring light. And then he came and sat on the low stone wall beside where she was working and was simply present, the way he had learned she preferred. without requiring her to stop or perform attention she wasn't ready to give. After a while, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. "You have something to say," she said. "Yes." "Then say it." He reached into his coat and held out his hand. In his palm lay a small ring, iron, simply made, with a single dark stone the color of a pine forest at dusk. Not a showy thing, not a political object, a quiet thing, made with intention. "I am not asking because of the bloodline," he said. "I am not asking because of the politics, or the pack, or any reason that has to do with anything other than the fact that you are the only person I have met in 11 years of ruling this kingdom who makes the weight of it feel like something worth carrying, rather than something to endure." He paused. "And because you sat down in the cold dirt to tend a wolf you thought was a stranger, and you did it the same way you do everything, without calculation, without expectation, just because it was the right thing." Clara looked at the ring. Then she looked at him. "You are still occasionally going to be difficult," she said. "Almost certainly," he agreed, "and I am going to continue doing things my own way. I would be disappointed if you didn't." She took the ring from his palm. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, the quiet, solid, unshowy weight of something built to last, rather than to impress. Then she put it on. He reached out and covered her hand with his, briefly, the way you hold something you intend to keep. Not tightly, steadily. Outside the tower garden, Iron Peak went about its morning, the guards changing at the gate, the pack moving through the yard below, the old record keeper Petra crossing the courtyard with an armful of scrolls, and the focused expression of a woman with important work to do. The pine forest spread green and dark below the walls, and the mountain air came through clean and cold, and tasting of the season that was coming, the long, difficult winter finally giving way. Clara looked out over the forest her mother had never seen. In the keep her bloodline had helped found and then hidden from for 60 years, beside the man who had crossed a feast hall to return a small carved clasp to a woman walking out a door. She thought of her father's hands moving over the applewood by firelight. The running wolf emerging from the grain. "This is what you are, little one. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She finally understood what he had meant. She had always been running. She just hadn't known yet what she was running toward. Now she did. And she was exactly where she was supposed to be.